in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to another edition of Inside the News. Glad to have you with us all across the country, whether it's on our radio affiliates or on SoundCloud, YouTube, or AUN TV. Thank you so much for joining us. Another busy week, and following Labor Day, we're now into heat of things. But let's welcome the guys. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing just great, Guy. It is a pleasure to be with you both once again.
All right, and Frank up there, what state are you in this week?
The state of disaster, the Empire State, New York. Great to be with you both, and thanks to our audience for tuning in.
He's picking on all those D words. We've had desperation, we had
disaster,
disaster, and we'll find out what next week will bring.
And it all rhymes with Democrat, all D words.
Ooh, very, very good. Did you like that, Ben? Ben's our resident author here. How you doing there, Ben? Do you like that?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Go ahead.
I think we've got a long way to go. So Frank needs to get active and keep coming up with good scripters.
Yeah. All right. Well, here's another one. The dilemma. There we go. And I did not know that, of the election day of 2020. And, we were talking a little bit off air, but this is going to prove to be one of the most unique elections in our nation's history. Frank, just kind of allude.
Unique is a rather interesting word compared to what we're going to be dealing with. Look, I believe the scenario for the election is possibly that on election night, Donald Trump is seen as having the majority of electoral votes, more than enough to win. In some cases, perhaps a substantial majority. However, the Democrats, as you know, Hillary Clinton told Joe Biden not to concede under any circumstances. John Kerry, former Secretary of State as well, has said that there should be violence in the streets if, in fact, Trump is the winner. If we look at the looming problem of the mail-in ballots, you can see a scenario where, despite a victory by Donald Trump, we see that there is going to be statements by a number of governors, Democrat governors in key swing states, that they have found, quote unquote, a number of ballots, a substantial number of ballots, all for Joe Biden. On closer inspection, I think a lot of those ballots will be signed by, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, etc. It'll all wind up in the courts. You assume the court will do the right thing. You can't be sure, but you hope. Which would be followed by a lot of disastrous rioting in the streets. Now, we have had historically in the past at least one contested presidential election, which wound up going to the House of Representatives. That, of course, would not be good news for Donald Trump, considering the majority in the House of Representatives, and particularly considering Nancy Pelosi. If for some reason this is not resolved by January 20th, Nancy Pelosi becomes president pro tem until this whole thing is straightened out.
Ben, we were talking a little bit off air, and once again, the Supreme Court would come into that. We've got hanging chads and all of that. But when I heard of this, maybe the ultimate plan to delay it to January 20th to put Pelosi in charge, and as Frank just alluded to, that should scare the living daylights out of America.
Well, unfortunately, I agree with Frank's scenario as being quite realistic. We are set up for that type of debate and fought out in the courts at the state level and ultimately at the Supreme Court level. In 2000, the Supreme Court stepped in to avoid this type of constitutional crisis and essentially called a halt to the ongoing and never-ending recount in the state of Florida and declared George Bush to be the winner of the election. The subsequent recount fortunately backed up that indeed George Bush had actually won the state of Florida. But this is going to be on a much greater magnitude because so many states have set up this system of millions of mail-in ballots. And we know from history, including current history, not just a distant history, but current elections, that these types of mail-in ballots are fraught with error and fraud and all sorts of issues. And a huge percentage of mail-in ballots are thrown out at the state level. And they often get thrown out by the state election committees that are set up and have very stringent rules and policies that they try to follow. And they'll throw these things out, and all that leads to, every instance of that leads to potential litigation. And when you're talking about what's at stake here, it's inevitable. We'll see if the Supreme Court has the ability to step in and stop this process, but it is entirely possible that we will go into the new year not knowing who won the November 3rd election.
You know, Ben's trying to pick up on what you're doing there, Frank, and he's using the F word, fraught with fraud. And, I'm thinking epic fail there. But, we are, you, and Ben, we all can see what's going to be happening here. And it's not a good scenario, is it?
No, it's not. And the unfortunate part of it is that in a couple of smaller elections where the mail-in ballot was used, there was the congressional district, the Maloney district in New York, and a one race for city council, I believe it was, in New Jersey. Mail-in ballots failed and failed miserably. Both of those states were thrown into chaos on just those small elections. You can imagine what would it be on a statewide election for president of the United States. Here also is the baffling point. If you want to say that the mail-in ballots are not an intentional invitation to fraud on the part of the Democratic Party, then why not use the absentee ballot method, which has been secured and used successfully for decades and decades?
And
look,
that means if it's absentee, that means the voter requests it. It's not just mailed in mass.
That's correct. And the safety with an absentee ballot, of course, is that it comes from a registered voter, someone already on the rolls. There's no pre-printed ballot, that's distributed en masse. It's all very secure, and it's worked successfully for decades. Our GIs use that every election. So it is a mystery unless one assumes that fraud is the intent of those supporting the mail-in ballots. Why simply the concept of absentee ballots during this COVID period were not used. And the only logical answer is that, fearing a loss in this 2020 election, a method has been devised to encourage wide-scale fraud.
Yeah. Now let's extend what we're going to be talking about in this first block here. And Ben, Black Lives Matter. There's a major push on that, and we've got climate change. And what everyone's trying to do, and we've seen cancel culture and things of that nature, is that they want to literally change hundreds of years of people's thinking and their upbringing. For example, Black Lives Matter and all. Not every, you just can't dictate, this is how you're going to think and this is how you're going to adjust. It's not that easy. And they knew back in the 60s during the civil rights movement that it needed to be a gradual process over a generation. And they failed to do the education process, and now they're trying to do it on force. Am I somewhat on point on this, for Ben?
Well, you're talking about a lot of different issues, but yes, these are very real issues. You have the BLM movement, which we've talked about as a Marxist movement. Their aim is to overthrow the capitalist system and replace it with some type of socialist, Marxist nirvana, of course, which has never existed and never will exist. It's an impossibility. Climate change, we've talked on and off about the issues around the science there. But what is particularly concerning right now is called the 1619 Project. It's led by a writer and contributor at the New York Times. It is endorsed by the New York Times. It is an effort to change history, to rewrite history more along the lines of critical race theory, and to essentially say that Black slaves were the economic foundation of America and that capitalism is evil, and brought all this about. What's interesting to me is that as an economist, when you look at history, the growth of the United States as an industrial and agricultural power really came about after the Civil War, and particularly the end of slavery. Slavery brings about a lot of cheap labor. That is the point of it. And cheap labor in the agricultural segment means there's not innovation. And it was the end of slavery, the end of that access to cheap labor, the growth of the population of the United States that led to a lot of the great industrial and mechanization revolution that came about in our agricultural sector and allowed us to become the breadbasket of the whole world. So all these theories, like critical race theory and 1619 Project, are nonsensical in terms of their application of racial dogma and racist theory to economics and history. And unfortunately, this project is being feted as the new left-wing progressive thing to do in school, and leading the way in the redefining of real history towards these racial theories. So it's not a good movement. The president is pushing back. He's recently issued an executive order banning critical race theory and the way it's taught inside the federal government, and it was been a revelation at how far that progressed under the Obama administration. I think it was a revelation to him. But these are dangerous ideas that are sweeping the country.
You know something, Frank, as we're talking about the 1619 Project, and for many listening or watching us right now, it might be the first time they're actually hearing this 1619 Project. The New York Times has always been that go-to place that media went to get their stories and all, 400 years after slavery. However, isn't immigration the same kind of thing, but it's not Black lives?
Well, of course, the myth of the 1619 Project is that, as Ben pointed out very well, that somehow slavery was the foundation of America. In fact, it was actually the retarding of American economic growth, and certainly pulled the country apart. If one cares to actually do real research, not what the Times calls research, you will find that the nation, even in the Revolution, was torn apart by slavery. Only a small segment, a few southern states really wanted it. It was actually something that hurt the nation more than helped it. It certainly is no way, shape, manner, or form the foundation of America. Now let's fast forward to Black Lives Matter. Again, as Ben pointed out, the color to be concerned with Black Lives Matter is not black, it's red. Black Lives Matter has as much interest in racial equality as the Ku Klux Klan does. Its only interest really is in spreading Marxism. Because Marxism has been rejected by the American people time after time, certainly in the past, 80 years now since the Great Depression period, Black Lives Matter has decided, perhaps somewhat interestingly, that they can't convince the public by the force of their reasons and by historical facts, and so they're going to try to shove it down our throats by force and threats. We've all seen over the past couple of days those horrendous pictures of Black Lives Matter, and frankly, a lot of Antifa mixed in with it. In fact, I think the majority might be Antifa, bursting into restaurants, assaulting elderly diners and so forth, essentially creating the same environment as we saw in Nazi Germany, where despite the better interest of the people and despite the better judgment of the people, they're basically told, accept our point of view or we will beat you senseless. And that's really what we're seeing right now.
Okay, Ben, we've only got about a minute or two left in this segment here, but the question is, what is the truth and who tells us the truth? It's a good question, isn't it?
Well, we used to have a method of determining what is objective truth, or as close to objective truth as possible, and it was done in our university system, in the global university system at leading universities. It was the method of Socratic method, the scientific method, the method of exposing ideas to debate and discussion and arriving at a consensus among leading minds as to what quote unquote the truth is. Perhaps there is no such thing as an objective truth, and I'd say that is a debatable issue, but when you allow politics and ideology to determine what reality is, historically speaking, that's when the danger comes in. And we see that in all of these movements. The climate science movement has become an ideological religion. And unfortunately, it has closed the door on any type of rational debate. So you see this in history as well. And this is what we're fighting against. It is the danger of what's occurred inside our universities over the last 30 to 40 years, where we have moved away from open debate and towards ideological driven discussion. That is a problem.
All right. We have just started the program, and we've got a lot more yet to cover. Guy Wehman, Ben Brunson, Frank Vernuccio. We're right here on Inside the News. We're going to be taking a look at China. It's involved with a lot of different things, advancing their military, but they want to pick a war with India. And what about Greece and Turkey? Oh, my goodness. We've got a lot more to cover. This is Inside the News. We're going to take our first time out. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.